Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about conditioning. Um, I want to first start off by talking about Mary Wollstonecraft and the interesting implications of her work. Mary Wollstonecraft brings into mind the problem with conditioning. She is a very interesting figure in the history of philosophy, and more importantly, an interesting figure in the Enlightenment. She's interesting because Mary Wollstonecraft was a female who did not live a conventional life according to her society, such as with sleeping with multiple males and living with multiple males and not marrying. Um, and and people definitely looked down on her for that. But part of that was because she wanted to challenge the conventions of her time, um, which is important to keep in mind. Another one of the really important ideas that she contributes to the history of philosophy is the whole idea that the Enlightenment was all about rights, all about the right and um, equality of people, um, but it didn't necessarily take into account what kind of people. And so females were often excluded from this process. Um, and because females were often excluded, um, Mary Wollstonecraft had a lot to write about and a lot to talk about. Um, and so, because it's definitely a contradiction, so how can the Age of Enlightenment, the age that's supposed to be an age of rationality and reason, and an age that uses reason to contribute to a more just world, still hold on to antiquated ideas, unfair ideas? It's really cool because Mary Wollstonecraft is essentially like the first feminist ever. Um, Maybe there's people that predate her that I'm not aware of, but she's certainly one of the most prominent feminists, and I would say certainly an important thinker, because of her leanings and because of the things that she believed in. And so one of the things you get out of Mary Wollstonecraft is this whole idea of going against the grain and not living a conventional life. And you might be wondering where I would like to go with this. That is indeed some background um, for what I want to say. And I have heard a really interesting question that Mary Wollstonecraft seemed to ask and articulate, which is, how did we become to be the way that we are? And more specifically, how do we become the way that we are? Well, how did society condition us to be the way that we are? And why is that the case? And why does that happen? And so I think this is interesting to keep in mind because in my experience, I feel like I've talked about this before, but I feel like I'm definitely conditioned in many ways to think a certain way. Um, According to evolutionary psychology, atypical thinking is excluded because is excluded from dialogues because it makes people feel unsafe. And so it's kind of a way of keeping out the contaminant, so to speak, keeping out the dangerous ideas, because people want to be able to integrate peaceably and sociably with society. And that's very difficult to do whenever you are with people who think atypically and do not conform. But I'm very struck by this question of how do we get conditioned to be the way that we are? And that's one answer that I have, is this evolutionary explanation in terms of thinking about how I have conditioned myself to operate in a certain way in society because that is what I've been taught. But on the same token, because I think atypically, in many ways, this is also a challenge because I've noticed the benefits of creativity and not thinking normally, so to speak, or at least according to the status quo, not having normalcy, and really asking questions and asking difficult questions, and not worried about fitting into the mold. And but I want to focus specifically on why I feel like I nonetheless have been conditioned a certain way. Now, what would this mean? Well, this would certainly mean that I feel as though I have been conditioned to behave a certain way. A friend of mine described certain behaviors that you would adhere to, certain social norms as a code, as the code, which I think is very, very interesting. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. But I would say that I conform in terms of behavior because I am exceptionally polite, for one thing. And I don't think that that's bad, but I think the reasons for why I do that, even though they're not disingenuous, I think that they come from, they essentially come from a fear of like a fear of conflict. And I think that that doesn't seem fair whenever we consider this notion that sometimes some of the best ideas are bold ideas and controversial ideas. But again, that goes back to the whole evolutionary idea about how we stick with safe ideas because it helps us to adapt to society better and adapt to our culture and our community better. And essentially that's what I want to challenge. And so the question that I'm trying to ask is, the question I'm trying to ask is, why have I been conditioned? And how have I been conditioned? And so I would definitely say in terms of behavior, I would definitely say in terms of the things that I say and the things that I want to say. So I've noticed that unless it's people that I really, really trust and that are open with me, I say things that I don't say the things that are really on my mind. And that probably sounds like a cliche, but it's true because I've noticed that whenever I speak what I'm really thinking, it tends to make people uncomfortable. And I've never been able to figure out why. I think maybe because of the intensity of it, but it makes people uncomfortable. And because it makes them uncomfortable, I tend to not say what's really on my mind. And there's a constant tension because I do still look for ways to say what's on my mind. I don't want to hide everything completely, and so I sublimate through writing. I write about many of my struggles because that's what makes sense. And so writing becomes a form of communicating some very deep problems. And so I think I've already certainly explained one of the main reasons why I conform via behavior, via conversation, and speech. And that is definitely because I'm afraid of conflict. I'm afraid of being labeled and being misunderstood in a way that leads to problems down the line, which has unfortunately happened. Now, I don't know if there's any grand philosophical concept that can be extrapolated from these experiences, but I would say that it is a problem because essentially it makes it hard to live an authentic life whenever you are stifled in this way. A friend of mine once described how the people that we admire most are the people that did not conform with society because they were so bold, and yet they knew the code well enough, so to speak, that they were still able to conform enough to get along. Now, I'm not sure how true this is, how well I would agree with it, but we'll use it as a frame, as framework for the idea that conformity isn't necessarily bad, and that bold ideas can exist with conformity. But I think that's where I struggle because that balance is really, really hard to find. Because I find myself wanting to be authentic, and in order to be authentic, to be an authentic person, it's not necessarily that you give into all of your impulses. It's not necessarily that you listen to all of your instincts, because I think rationality and reason are certainly an important part of the process. But it would seem to me that if you want to be authentic, there's got to be a way to execute some of the most important actions and words, actions for sure, execute actions, as well as say the most important ideas and words that are on your mind. So as an example, I've noticed that when I'm talking to people, I do this unconsciously and consciously too, because I'm aware of it as a problem. But I kind of, and this doesn't mean I'm not authentic, by the way, but it means that it challenges my authenticity. But the idea is that I essentially am kind of like a chameleon. So when I can see where the conversation is going, I model my language, I model my ideas around the logic of the conversation. And I think this is an adaptive trait that I have slowly been able to cultivate as I realize that my atypical thinking and my atypical thoughts cause problems. Now, what's interesting about this idea, though, is that sometimes that's not necessarily, well, I would say that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I would say that that's not even necessarily all that I do. Because I've noticed that whenever I find people who are genuine, I'm able to communicate better what is on my mind. But this happens with varying degrees, especially in terms of behavior. So I've noticed that I've always had to return over and over again to rationality and reason. Whenever I'm making decisions that I think are impulsive or instinctual, because I'm afraid that they'll lead to conflict, that they will lead to conflict. So as an example, there was a friend of mine who was very open with me, but he didn't know much about my mental illness, but I was open with him, and I slowly started unfolding kind of my delusional thinking, because I was slowly spiraling into delusion. And I was like, I want to take a permanent marker and write on your stag. Now, if I had done what my instincts and impulses had told me to do, I definitely would have drawn on the stag. But of course, I had to use reason to understand that that would have been like crossing boundaries, and that wouldn't have been okay. I certainly wouldn't have liked somebody to draw on my stag. Although what's interesting is I feel like I certainly would have been okay with it if I would have understood the meaning and significance of that. And so, but the idea is that I still ultimately had to use reason and rationality in order to kind of frame the delusional thinking. And so the question that you're left with asking is this a form of conditioning, or is this authentic behavior? And I think that that's the question that I have a hard time answering, because in all honesty, I'm not sure. On the one hand, it seems like, so using this as an example, on the one hand, it seems like conditioning, because it seems that I didn't do what my instincts told me I should do. But on the other hand, it definitely seems like it was a form of authenticity, because I did, through speech, say what was on my mind. And so I would say that in terms of conditioning and the implications of conditioning, there's certainly no easy way to describe how we become conditioned, or why we become conditioned. But for me personally, I've certainly been able to come to the conclusion that the reason why I feel as though I am conditioned is because I feel like I must essentially behave a certain way, or otherwise it will trigger alarms, so to speak. And that is through conforming to the social norms that I read around me. And whether this is a form of authenticity or not, I'm not sure. But I do want to say that I challenge the problem with having to use too much reason and too much rationality, and that sometimes we have to make decisions, or we should at least be able to make decisions, simply because they make the world a more diverse place. So in that example, let's say that I would have drawn on the stag. It may have led to conflict, it may have led to trouble, but I personally think that from my end, it would have satisfied something that I felt I needed to do. And on the same token, it would have made the world more diverse, and it would have been an interesting action. But of course, there's the logical side of me that would say that that is not the best idea, and so naturally I wouldn't have done it. And that was why I ultimately didn't do it. And I would say that that was why I reasoned through it, to be able to think through it. Again, this is Phoenix, and this is my talk on conditioning. And there's no grand sweeping philosophical theory with this idea of conditioning, but just to try to put the ball in your court and think about what conditions you, and are you living an authentic life, or are you conditioned? Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.